Well, big picture, I would say that the drug war has lived beyond its usefulness. I think everyone who looks at the situation today realizes that addiction and treating addiction in a public health scenario is really where we need to be headed, and the old Nixon era criminal justice model has failed, has simply not, in the 50 years that it's been with us, scaled back the problems. We continue to have an overdose crisis. We can, in some ways, our enforcement efforts almost appear to exacerbate the problems. And so it's time for us to step back and reconsider what we're doing.
What are your concerns when it comes to the use of confidential informants in the drug enforcement proceedings from law enforcement, all different varieties of law enforcement?
Well, I would say that the use of confidential informants is most problematic in the drug war, for sure. That's where it's used most aggressively and in more problematic situations. And in particular, what we've seen in Texas over and over are, frankly, corrupt law enforcement collaborating with known criminals, because a confidential informant is simply someone who has been accused of a crime, and the cop or the district attorney says, I won't hold you accountable for that crime if you do me a favor. That's what a confidential informant is. And so what you see is law enforcement collaborating with criminals in ways that are problematic and sometimes corrupt. Whenever you see a corrupt informant, there is almost always a corrupt police officer involved. There are checks and balances that can be used to sort of eliminate, especially in the drug purchase scenario, some of the bigger problems. So for example, if you're sending a confidential informant into a house, that person should be searched beforehand so that you know they're not taking in drugs and planting them when you go in and do the raid. Well, apparently in the cases you're talking about, that's exactly what they didn't do. Well, it's a choice not to utilize those best practices. If I know that that's what you're supposed to do, then the police detectives know that that's what you're supposed to do. It's a decision to send them in without that, and to do it systematically is not just a failure by those individual detectives, but a failure by the supervisors in charge of them as well. It means that no one's watching the store.
And my understanding is when they are using a confidential informant, they're trying to find the next bigger guy up on the ladder, you would imagine, right? So we got this guy, he's got a certain amount of methamphetamine. We want to know who's supplying you. They're trying to climb the ladder. But what we have seen in our cases here is those confidential informants, rather than finding somebody bigger, was planting a very similar amount of drugs on people that were his customers, drug users.
I think
and now they've got like a felony level drug trafficking charge where they were just buying personal use amounts.
And I think what you're describing there is the distinction between sort of the PR version of what snitching is about and the in real life version. You always hear the police say, oh, we have to have the informants to go after the big fish. Well, the reality is, in the drug war, big fish get off, little fish get eaten. That's the running phrase you hear in the courthouse. And it's the truth. You never see anyone turning on someone upward. It's always downward. And you see this systematically when in Houston PD they did an audit of their narcotics division. Almost all the cases that they were getting with informants were less than a gram cases.
Right.
They weren't big fish. It's just not true. You can say it over and over, and they certainly have. That's how it's always justified. Right. The math, the statistics and data tells us that the massive volume of cases that you're producing with these methods are not big fish.
Right.
That's just not true.
So why do they continue to use confidential informants? What is the benefit?
Cops are judged on very antiquated metrics. And there's an assumption that, arresting more people for more crimes is them doing a better job. Well, when you're talking about drug addiction, which is the root of the problem that we're talking about here, just arresting more people isn't necessarily a public benefit. It's not a public good. But the metrics that we judge the cops by on the job don't take into account any of those greater public good. If someone's not arrested, but they end up entering counseling because they had an interaction with a police officer that was positive, that police officer won't get credit for that in any way that they're judged on the job. But if they make an arrest, that's one more tally that they can say, well, I had X number of arrests this year, and it looks like you're doing something. We have outdated frameworks for how we analyze what cops do that might be appropriate when you're talking about, say, thefts. You can say, okay, there were X number of burglaries and we caught, X percent of those and returned their goods. Well, those metrics are meaningful. When you say, well, we had, 500 arrests last month for drugs. Well, how many addicts are there? There's tens of thousands. And the people that you arrested aren't necessarily going to stop using drugs either. Right. And so what have you really solved? Once society began using police officers for basically social problems, for addiction, for mental health, for child welfare, for things that are not, oh, I had my stuff stolen, or oh, I was assaulted, right, bring me justice. All of a sudden we're using them in these say public health situations where just arresting someone, it doesn't solve a problem. There's no goods to return to the victim. There is no victim. So I feel like that we're trying, that when you talk about arrests and judging cops on more arrests, that is like a holdover from a past era when cops did far fewer things. Right.
Now they're the utility knife. Go fix all the problems.
That's right. We don't invest in anything to fix mental health. We don't, or not as much. You look at how much the city spends on mental health compared to the police department's budget. We spend vastly more on police, and so when you're making those choices, the cops are the only ones you have to send. But that doesn't mean, though, that the traditional ways that they've been employed are going to work for these, I'm calling them new responsibilities. They're not new now. They've now had them for decades. But in the scheme of the history of policing, that's the new development. There are these social problems that we're sending law enforcement to, but that may not be the right way to deal with it.
Right. When it comes to using these confidential informants, it seems like there's a real lack of transparency and oversight over it, and a real invitation for there to be misbehavior when this is going on because of that lack of oversight and lack of transparency.
Right. And I will say that both the police departments and the unions fight tooth and nail at every effort to implement oversight or transparency.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you're not surprised at all that innocent people end up going to jail in these situations?
No, because we didn't fix the problems when we had the chance. And we have now, for example, I keep going back to this case in Houston, the Tuttle case, because that was so egregious, and it turned out so many narcotics officers were engaged in bad behavior, in those cases. And we tried in 2001, after the Tulia drug stings, to get a requirement to require corroboration for police officer testimony in drug cases. We got it for informants, but we did not get it for police. Well, so we turn around 20 years later, and in that case, uncorroborated testimony from a police officer has sent dozens and dozens of innocent people to prison. Right. And everyone, even George Floyd even received a letter, or they sent it to him. He never received it. It was sent to an old address saying this cop whose testimony sent you to prison is unreliable, and you could probably get your case overturned, get a lawyer. But so we had a chance to fix that. It was a choice not to do so. The entire policing profession opposed it. The legislature sided with the unions and the cops and said, no, we're not going to do oversight, and so we don't have it. Similarly, the Commission on Law Enforcement this session had they were up for sunset review, which is their once every 12-year analysis, and this TCOL is the agency that licenses police officers. Right. Well, they had proposed, the Sunset Commission had some really very modest strengthening of the licensing agency's ability to provide oversight, and the police unions killed it entirely. We didn't even have a sunset bill this time, and it just got eliminated. You can go look at the coverage, and it was very straightforward. Police unions didn't want it, we're not going to do it.
So has there been any sort of reform since 2001, that little bit that was able to get passed then?
Not very much. Policing, because law enforcement is so powerful, is the hardest nut to crack in the criminal justice reform world. It's easier to go after sentencing, it's easier to go after probation, it's easier even to do things on the parole side. But policing, because the police unions are so powerful, and because frankly Democratic lawmakers in the big cities pander to them in ways that are unhelpful, it's been the toughest nut to crack. And while Texas has had quite a few criminal justice reforms, again, I worked for the Innocence Project. We passed a lot of innocence legislation, and probably more innocence-themed legislation than any other state in the union. But policing is the one area where we've never broken through in the 20-some-odd years I've been working on these topics.
And so how do you ever really get reform if you can't take care of that aspect of it? I mean, we're ever going to get to that point?
We have not so far.
Right. Do you think that there will come a time when we do?
I'm in my mid-50s. I thought so 25 years ago when I started doing all this, and I would like to think so, but not in my lifetime. I feel like that you look at the backlash we've seen after the protests last summer and everything that happened at the legislature this session on these topics, and I think we're a long way from the politicians who are in power in Texas today being willing to stand up to police interests. She is the hero of this story because she was facing greater risk than a firefighter running into a burning building. She was putting her entire future on the line. And I think that's what people really need to understand about these cases, is how much pressure is on those individuals. And the Conviction Integrity Unit is a way for those stories to be heard, but it requires an incredible amount of courage to tell that story. And you notice in her situation, and this is typical in those Conviction Integrity Units, she had to fight probably for years before they picked it up. Yep. Someone has to basically be a hero before the DA's Conviction Integrity Units will take those on, right, and really prove the case up for them in many ways. Now, to answer your question about those Conviction Integrity Units, those have been incredibly useful, but they are hit or miss. And they very much depend on who the district attorney, and even more so who's named as the head of that unit, and whether or not they are reporting separately to the DA or under the appellate unit. And often the ones under the appellate units aren't very aggressive because they don't want them overturning the cases they're trying to keep from being overturned. They have a sort of a conflict of interest there. And so what you see is when you have a case like this that turns out, you know, the right way, it's really usually a function of the individuals who were put there going above and beyond. We have some conviction integrity units that don't generate too many overturned convictions. Then we have, you see those sometimes, like in Houston, they had a conviction integrity unit that had just barely had a trickle of overturned convictions. All of a sudden, Inger Chandler was named head of that unit, and they did like 300 of these drug case exonerations where the cops were setting people up based on the field tests that turned out to later be overturned. Right. And she figured out that this was happening en masse, and that there were lots of people who they had been convicted based on these field tests, but later came back and they weren't drugs. Mm-hmm. And so because this one lawyer was being very aggressive, they had like 300 and some odd exonerations in just a couple of years. Well, most of them, it's 2-3 a year.
Right. I mean, they're kind of disincentivized to try to do this, because if they do find one where you end up with, you pull the string and you've got 300 cases, now you've got a real mess on your hands, because
That's right.
You've got to go back and fix all these cases.
That's right. And what you also see is that they're more effective when you get a new DA, mm-hmm. because the person who's been the incumbent for 3 terms doesn't want you digging into their cases. Right. But you get a new DA, and they don't mind doing the backward review at their predecessors. Right. And so, so the conviction integrity units are a bit hit or miss. They really depend on who's there. In all cases, though, where you see someone exonerated, and especially in a case like this, when you really dig into the weeds, there's some individual defendant who just very courageously fought. I'll tell you, when I was at the Innocence Project of Texas, I spent a lot of time looking at all of the various estimates about how many innocent people are convicted for various types of things. I believe almost all the estimates that you see are low, because they usually are based on the types of cases that we see DNA exonerations in, not the drug war. Our best estimates are that somewhere between 1% and 2% of people who are convicted are innocent people who are falsely convicted. My belief is that that's probably low, because so many convictions in the drug war are in this dubious gray area. And again, all those estimates are based on DNA exonerations and the types of things that happen more in like violent crimes. And so, so I think that it's thousands and thousands for sure, because the system is so massive now. The number of people that cycle through it is massive. There's 850,000 or so people arrested in Texas every year. Was upward of 1 million. It's been going down, right. But you know, so large numbers of those people, you know, their cases are dismissed and they never should have been arrested in the first place. But even those that are actually convicted, thousands and thousands of them fall into this category of actually innocent. Mm-hmm. And almost all of the innocence discussion has been around things that DNA can exonerate you for. Right. The rape, the murder. These drug cases, I feel like
it's almost impossible.
That's right. And is on a order of magnitude larger scale.
How do we fix it? What would your suggestion be to fix this?
Well, again, I said that this had happened because of death by 1,000 cuts. And so there is no silver bullet that does this, right? I mean, we need 1,000 reforms in the other direction, and for people with the intention of moving things in the other direction to be in power over time and making decisions over time that move the ball forward. I do think on the specific case that you came to talk to me about, there are best practices at the police department level that could be implemented. Again, searching someone before they go in and when they come back out. That person should have been wearing a wire. There's also, so, and Sasha Natapov, the professor, can talk to you about some of those details. So in this particular situation, there are some best practices that could have prevented that. The reason they weren't ever implemented after the past scandals is the political culture and the lack of political backbone that I spoke to more broadly. So,
right. Is there justice when it happens in the shadows?
No, I don't even know what that word means anymore. I go with Chris Christopherson's line, I want justice, but I'll settle for some mercy. I feel like when you're talking about people struggling with addiction, I don't know what justice a cop can bring to you. I'm not sure what outcome we want that we think a cop in jail or prison is going to lead to. What does justice mean in that context? I don't even think that the words are meaningful.
Is society safer when we're arresting people like this using informants?
Oh, I think not at all, because the underlying problem, again, is addiction. It's a public health problem. And so we're treating a public health problem with cops and guns and jails, and that's not what's causing it, so that's not going to solve it.